Scarlet Crusaders, Chapter 1, The Ramparts Watch. The tavern was alive with noise, clinking tankards, bursts of laughter, and the hum of a bard's lute. Shadows danced across the low beams as firelight flickered, mixing with the earthy smell of spiced ale and damp wool. Soldiers crowded the room, their crimson cloaks a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wooden tables. Corwin leaned back in his chair, his armor undone and helm discarded beneath the table. His fingers brushed a lock of the barmaiden's hair as she bent closer to hear him over the din. "It's only a few hours. They won't miss me," he said, his grin teasing but lazy. "They might," she replied, her voice low, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "And the captain will have your head." Before he could reply, the door slammed open with a crack that silenced the room. A gust of cold air swept in, along with the tall figure of Captain Ryan. His scarred face twisted in anger as his eyes scanned the room. "Corwin," Ryan's voice boomed, sharp and unyielding. "Rampart, now, unless you'd like to spend the next week shoveling dung out of the stables." The room burst into low chuckles as Corwin groaned, rising reluctantly. He shot the maiden a wink and leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Don't wait up," he murmured. "Maybe I won't," she quipped, but her hand lingered on his arm. The streets of Highwall were quiet now, the echoes of the tavern fading as Corwin trudged toward the ramparts. The city rose around him like a fortress, its towering walls carved directly into the cliff face of the great seawall. The thunder of waves crashing against stone reverberated beneath his boots, a constant reminder of the city's isolation. The streets were alive in their own way. Dim lanterns lit merchant stalls, their goods packed for the night. Beggars huddled in alleys, their thin forms wrapped in scraps of cloth. The air smelled of salt and damp stone, a reminder that even here, high above the sea, the ocean ruled. Highwall was impregnable on three sides, flanked by jagged cliffs and an unyielding ocean. Only the front faced the plains, its sprawling ramparts the sole defense against what lay beyond. Corwin reached the base of the ramparts, the air growing colder as he ascended the stone steps. The torches atop the wall flickered against the night wind, casting long shadows over the parapet. At the top, Harlan leaned against his spear, his face haggard with boredom. "Took your time," he muttered. "Captain's got a sense of humor," Corwin replied, slipping on his helm. "What's the word?" "Quiet. Spotted a few Worgons skulking near the tree line earlier, but they didn't linger, probably picking over the remains of the last patrol." Corwin frowned but said nothing. The Worgon, wolf-like creatures with hollow eyes and decayed flesh, were scavengers at best, harbingers at worst. He settled into his post, the open plains stretching before him under the cold light of the moon. At first, it was still, the faint rustle of wind through the grass, the distant hoot of an owl. But something pricked at the edge of Corwin's senses, a faint movement on the horizon. He squinted, leaning forward, the hairs on his neck rising as the shadow took shape. A mass of figures moved in the distance, their shuffling gait unnatural, their forms twisted and broken. Moonlight glinted off bone and steel as the horde grew larger, a sickening wave of decay spilling toward the city. "Gods," Corwin whispered, his breath frosting in the night air. "Alarm! The undead! To arms!" Corwin's voice rang out, piercing the night as bells began to toll. The sound of his shout and the deep resonance of the bells sent soldiers scrambling through the city, lanterns flaring to life as the streets filled with shouts and hurried footsteps. Corwin tore himself away from the sight of the advancing horde, his boots pounding against the stone as he sprinted toward the central barracks. The cool night air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop, weaving through the chaos of soldiers arming themselves. He burst into the command chamber, where Captain Ryan stood hunched over a map, barking orders to his lieutenants. "Sir!" Corwin shouted, his voice sharp and urgent. "They're here. The undead horde is marching on the city." Ryan's head snapped up, his face grim. Without a word, he strode past Corwin, his crimson cloak trailing behind him as he ascended the rampart stairs two at a time. Corwin followed, his pulse pounding as the bells grew louder. From the top of the wall, Ryan stopped and stared. The plains below were no longer empty. They churned with movement, the undead advancing like a tide of decay. The moonlight glinted off jagged bones and rusted armor, their grotesque forms stretching to the horizon. Gods have mercy, Ryan muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the parapet. Corwin came to stand beside him, his face pale but resolute. What do we do, sir? Ryan's jaw tightened. He turned, his voice calm but commanding. Sound the full alarm. Wake every man and woman, arm the ballistae, and pray. As the bells tolled and the city sprang to life below them, Ryan and Corwin stood side by side, the cold wind biting at their faces. The battle for Highwall had begun, and the weight of their survival rested on their shoulders. Chapter 2. The battle begins. Captain Ryan's voice rang out over the ramparts, cutting through the growing tension. Archers to the walls. Hold the gate at all costs. We defend this city with our lives. His words carried a gravity that silenced the murmurs of uncertainty among the soldiers. He pointed to the battlements. Double the watch. Light the torches. Keep your eyes sharp for anything unusual. We cannot afford mistakes tonight. The soldiers scrambled to obey, the clang of metal boots and weapons filling the air. Ryan's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the undead horde churned like a living shadow against the moonlit plains. Turning to his second-in-command, he barked, I need to inform the paladin commanders. Hold the line until I return. The captain descended the stone stairs, his cloak billowing behind him as he made his way to the High Court. The High Court loomed ahead, its walls pristine and white, a stark contrast to the worn stone of the rest of Highwall. 2 guards stood at the golden gate, their polished armor gleaming even in the faint torchlight. They crossed their spears as Ryan approached. Halt, one of the guards commanded. Entry to the High Court is restricted. Show your orders. Ryan's jaw tightened, and his voice was sharp with frustration. Orders? The undead are at our gates, and you're wasting time with protocol? Without orders, we... Damn your orders! Ryan roared, stepping forward. Let me through, or you can answer to the horde yourself. The guards exchanged uneasy glances before stepping aside. Be quick, Captain, one muttered. Ryan stormed past them, his boots echoing in the polished hallways of the High Court. The High Court was a sanctuary of beauty and order. Ornate stained glass windows depicted stories of divine battles, their colors glowing faintly in the moonlight. Golden chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting soft light over marble floors. Crusaders moved through the halls, their expressions calm, their tasks routine. Ryan couldn't help but feel a surge of anger at their obliviousness. The horde was coming, and they had no idea what awaited them beyond these pristine walls. He found the paladin commander in a side chamber, poring over ancient texts with 2 clerics at his side. The commander was a tall figure, his silver-plated armor reflecting the light of nearby candles. Commander Aldrich, Ryan said, his voice strained. Aldrich looked up, his piercing blue eyes narrowing at the sight of the captain's disheveled state. Captain Ryan, he said smoothly, what brings you here at such an hour? Ryan leaned against the doorway, catching his breath. The horde, it's here, at our gates. The room fell silent. The clerics exchanged worried glances, but Aldrich's expression remained unreadable. After a moment, he smiled faintly. Well, Aldrich said, let us greet them properly. The ramparts were chaos when they returned. Shouts and screams mingled with the tolling of the bells. The undead pressed closer, their grotesque forms illuminated by the light of the torches. Form ranks, Aldrich's voice boomed, cutting through the cacophony. Archers, to your marks. Ballistae, ready your aim. Hold the gate until I give the signal. Soldiers scrambled to obey, their movements frantic but purposeful. And prepare the retribution ball, Aldrich commanded. A murmur of excitement rippled through the troops as the order was relayed. At the gate, a massive iron ball, adorned with glowing holy runes, was rolled into position. Ryan glanced at Aldrich. Will it hold them back? It will do more than that, Aldrich replied, his tone confident. The undead swarmed the bridge connecting the city to the mainland, their rotted limbs clawing at the stone. Release the judgment ball, Aldrich shouted. The giant iron sphere rolled forward, gathering speed as it barreled down the narrow bridge. Undead were crushed or sent tumbling into the sea as the ball tore through their ranks. The soldiers cheered, but Aldrich's focus remained unbroken. Hold the line, he barked. This is only the beginning. The undead pressed closer, but the clear path left by the retribution ball gave the defenders a brief reprieve. Aldrich turned to the soldiers at the ramparts, his commanding voice cutting through the chaos. "We have bought ourselves time," he declared. "But we will need every sword and every prayer to hold this city. I will return with more crusaders to join the fight. Until then, stand firm, for Highwall, for the light." The soldiers raised their weapons in response, their cries echoing into the night as Aldrich descended the ramparts. Rhine remained, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the undead horde loomed, the weight of survival pressing ever heavier on his shoulders. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Commander Aldrich descended the ramparts, his silver armor catching the flickering torchlight as he barked orders to the soldiers around him. The undead threat loomed closer, but his focus remained unwavering. "To all civilians," he called out, his voice echoing through the streets. "Women and children, stay inside. Men, arm yourselves and prepare for battle. Every sword will be needed before this night ends." As the people scattered to obey, Aldrich turned to a group of guards at the gate. "Hold the line until reinforcements arrive. I must summon the High Council of Light. Highwall will not fall tonight." Without waiting for a response, Aldrich mounted his steed and galloped through the city streets, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. The High Council of Light convened in their grand chamber, its towering stained glass windows casting radiant patterns of divine victories onto the polished marble floors. Around a circular table, 6 members debated the kingdom's future with a mix of frustration and urgency. "Trade routes are still unsafe," grumbled High Cleric Elias, his gnarled hands resting on the table. "Bandits run rampant in the north, and our resources are spread thin. Without intervention, our people will starve before the year is out." Paladin Commander Lyara, her crimson-trimmed armor shining in the candlelight, crossed her arms. "We cannot afford to waste time on logistics while threats close in from every direction. Our priority must be our defenses." "Defenses alone will not sustain us," retorted Inquisitor Marek, his dark eyes narrowing. "We need stronger recruitment campaigns, or we will be outnumbered before long." The youngest member of the council, Scribe Seelan, leaned forward, her voice cautious. "There is something else to consider. The eastern villages have reported strange sightings, a shadow that moves like a storm, growing stronger with each passing week." Elias broke it with a scoff. "Rumors. Villagers see what they wish to see in their fears. We have no time to chase shadows." "And yet," Marek interjected, "if these shadows are tied to the darkness we fight, can we afford to ignore them?" Before the debate could continue, the heavy chamber doors burst open with a deafening crash. The council members turned as Commander Aldrich stormed in, his armor streaked with dirt and blood, his face pale but determined. "The horde is here," Aldrich said, his voice ringing through the room. "Highwall is under siege." Elias rose slowly from his chair, his expression grim. "So the rumors are true." Lyara unsheathed her blade, the sound sharp and final. "Enough talk. If Highwall falls, we lose our foothold in the west. Gather your forces and let us march." Marek stood as well, his piercing gaze on Aldrich. "Tell us everything you know. How long do we have?" Aldrich took a steadying breath. "Not long. The ramparts hold for now, but the horde grows by the hour. I rode here for reinforcements. Without your aid, Highwall will fall." Elias nodded solemnly. "Then it is decided. Summon the Crusaders. Tonight, we march." The High Council descended from their chamber in unison, their crimson and white robes trailing behind them like a tide of resolve. Commander Aldrich led the way, his gauntleted hand gripping the hilt of his blade. Along the way, he called out to nearby clerics and priests. "Summon the healers! There are wounded at the ramparts who need the light's touch." The priests nodded, their holy staves glowing faintly as they gathered their tools and joined the march. The halls of the High Court rang with urgency, yet a strange calmness settled over the group as they moved with purpose. When the council reached the ramparts, they found no clashing swords or howling undead. Instead, the holy retribution ball rested at the bridge's mouth, its glowing runes still pulsating with divine energy. On the far side of the bridge, the horde seethed and writhed like a storm held at bay, their decayed limbs clawing uselessly at the air. Aldrich approached the edge of the parapet, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. "The holy energy holds them back," he murmured. For now. A soldier rushed up to the group, his armor battered and streaked with blood. He saluted quickly before speaking. Commander, the undead surged after the ball was deployed. It crushed dozens and forced the rest back. They've held their position since, but the barrier won't last forever. Casualties? Aldrich asked, his voice even. Minimal, thanks to the ball, sir, the soldier replied. But the men are exhausted. They've held the line all night. Aldrich nodded. You and your comrades fought well. Rest while you can. Reinforcements are here. As the soldier stepped aside, priests began moving through the ranks, their hands glowing with warm, golden light. They knelt by the wounded, murmuring prayers as the divine energy closed wounds and eased pain. The injured soldiers watched with awe and gratitude as the light restored their strength. High Cleric Elias joined Aldrich at the parapet, his gaze fixed on the horde across the bridge. The barrier has bought us time, but it won't hold indefinitely. The horde grows restless. Aldrich's jaw tightened. Then we use this time wisely. Rest our soldiers, fortify the walls, and prepare for their next move. Highwall will not fall. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but his words faltered. His gaze sharpened, fixed on the bridge. Aldrich, look. Aldrich followed his gaze, his stomach sinking as he realized what was happening. The undead were moving, not toward the ball, but around it. They were climbing atop one another, locking limbs, creating a grotesque bridge of flesh and bone. As the structure grew, the other undead began crawling across, bypassing the barrier entirely. The priests paused their chants, their glowing hands faltering as the defenders stared in silent horror. The horde's chilling moans filled the air, and Aldrich's voice rang out firm but filled with urgency. Sound the alarm, the battle is far from over. Chapter 4, The Light Strikes. Paladin Commander Liara stood atop the ramparts, her crimson-trimmed armor gleaming in the torchlight. Her sharp eyes scanned the battlefield below, where the undead horde seethed like a black tide, advancing relentlessly. Despite the glow of the holy retribution ball, the horde's grotesque bridge of flesh and bone grew with each passing moment. Enough of this, Liara muttered, her voice like steel. She turned sharply to a nearby priest, her tone commanding. Summon holy fire from the heavens, burn them to ash. The priest bowed and raised his staff, the crystal atop it glowing with divine energy. Across the ramparts, priests chanted in unison, their voices weaving into a single powerful hymn. The skies darkened as golden light erupted from above, streaking down like divine arrows. The undead bridge erupted in flames, shrieking as holy fire consumed it, severing their path. Paladins, Liara barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Consecrate the ground. Let no unholy being cross our line. Paladins surged forward, their shields raised and their weapons glowing with holy light. They struck the earth with their weapons, sending ripples of golden energy into the ground. The consecrated terrain glowed faintly, halting the undead's advance and forcing them to stumble back, their corrupted forms unable to touch the sanctified ground. Liara watched as the horde hesitated, their momentum temporarily stalled, but she knew it wouldn't last. The undead were relentless, and their numbers were endless. Liara descended the ramparts, her crimson cloak billowing as she strode into the chaotic command post. Soldiers scrambled to reinforce defenses, their faces etched with exhaustion. She slammed her gauntleted fist onto the table, silencing the room. The barrier and holy fire won't hold forever, she said, her voice unwavering. We need to push them back before they regroup. I'll lead a holy charge. Gasps filled the room. Commander, one soldier began, his voice trembling. A charge, that's suicide. Liara's gaze was fierce. It's not suicide, it's salvation. The light will guide us. She turned to the priests. Form a barrier of divine energy to shield the charge. Paladins, you'll strike with me. We will carve through their ranks and force them to retreat. The soldiers nodded reluctantly, their fear tempered by Liara's unshakable resolve. The battlefield glowed with divine energy as the priests raised their staves, creating a shimmering barrier of light. Liara stood at the forefront, her blade glowing with holy power. Behind her, the paladins formed ranks, their shields and weapons radiant. For Highwall, Liara roared, raising her sword high. The charge erupted like a storm, the barrier moving with them as they surged into the horde. Holy light burst forth with every strike, sending undead flying or disintegrating them on contact. The horde faltered, their bridge collapsing as the charge tore through their ranks. The undead retreated, their shrieks echoing into the night as they fell back beyond the range of the retribution ball. The battlefield grew silent, save for the labored breaths of the paladins. Liara returned to the council briefly. "Hold strong," she commanded. "I need the High Priestess. She must summon Michael if we're to win this war." Without waiting for a response, she rushed through the dimly lit halls of the High Court, her boots echoing against the stone. She reached the gilded doors of the High Priestess's chambers and pushed them open without hesitation. Inside, the sight stopped her in her tracks. The High Priestess, draped in a hastily gathered robe, stood beside a junior cleric, his face pale with shock. Liara's eyes narrowed, her voice cold. "What is the meaning of this?" The High Priestess drew herself up, her face flushed with both embarrassment and indignation. "Commander Liara, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" Liara's jaw tightened. "My apologies, but we don't have time for your games. Put your toy away and summon Michael. Now." The High Priestess hesitated, but Liara's glare brooked no argument. She nodded reluctantly, dismissing the cleric before turning to prepare the summoning ritual. The High Priestess, her face still flushed, reached for her ceremonial robes, but Liara stepped forward, her tone firm but measured. "Let me help," Liara said, lifting the heavy fabric and securing the intricate clasps. "We don't have time to waste." As she helped the High Priestess into her armor, polished silver adorned with glowing red and white symbols of the light, Liara spoke quickly. "The horde has been pushed back for now, but their numbers are endless. The retribution ball holds the bridge, but they've already begun to adapt. They're relentless, and we'll need every ounce of strength to hold them off." The High Priestess, now fully dressed, secured her helm and adjusted her staff. Her eyes, once filled with embarrassment, now burned with resolve. "And Michael?" Liara nodded. "We need him. Only his light can break their advance entirely." The High Priestess took a deep breath and strode toward the chamber doors, Liara following closely. They emerged onto the ramparts, where the battlefield stretched out before them. The undead horde writhed like a living shadow in the distance, regrouping for their next assault. The glowing runes of the holy retribution ball flickered faintly at the bridge's mouth, and the wounded were being tended by priests whose golden light illuminated the scene. The High Priestess stepped forward, her staff glowing faintly as she gazed at the chaos below. "Then let us prepare," she said, her voice steady. "The light will not falter." Liara bowed her head slightly. "We'll hold the line until Michael arrives." Chapter 5. The Blessing of Light. The High Priestess stood atop the altar, her staff raised high as golden light radiated outward in waves. Her voice boomed across the battlefield, carrying a divine resonance that silenced even the chaos of war. "By the light, let your strength be magnified. Let your blades strike true, your spells burn brighter, and your will remain unbroken." The Crusaders around her shuddered as the blessing enveloped them, a visible aura of gold shimmering over their forms. The air grew electric as the power surged through their ranks. Plus 140 attack power, plus 10% spell critical chance, 5% melee and ranged critical chance. Duration, 2 hours or until death. The soldiers cheered, their spirits bolstered by the divine power. The High Priestess lowered her staff and turned toward the ancient altar, its surface carved with runes that glowed faintly in response to her presence. The High Priestess knelt before the altar, her polished armor reflecting the flickering candlelight. She placed her staff reverently across the runed surface, the crystalline tip pulsing faintly as if responding to her touch. She began to chant, her voice soft and melodic, weaving ancient prayers that carried a tangible weight. The language was one few could understand, syllables that resonated with power, each word vibrating in the air like a string plucked on a celestial harp. The runes carved into the altar glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with her voice. The High Priestess extended her hands over the altar, her fingers trembling slightly as golden strands of light flowed from her palms and wove into the runes. The energy swirled and coalesced like threads being spun into a divine tapestry. Behind her, The priests stood watch, their glowing staves held high, the crystalline tips casting faint prisms of light onto the stone walls. One priest, his face etched with concern, stepped forward cautiously. "High Priestess, the energy is faltering. Do you require assistance?" She nodded without looking up, her voice steady despite the strain. "Lend me your strength, I will not fail." The priests formed a circle around her, their movements deliberate and synchronized. As they began to chant, their voices joined hers, weaving into a single powerful hymn. Each priest raised their staff, and beams of golden light arced from the crystals, connecting at the altar. The runes flared brighter, the glow intensifying as the energy converged. The ground beneath them hummed faintly, and the air became charged, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to their will. Sweat beaded on the High Priestess's brow as she maintained the chant, her hands never faltering as she poured her energy into the ritual. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the divine light pulsating in perfect harmony with her voice. Corwin's heart pounded as he fought amidst the chaos, his sword flashing in the golden light of the High Priestess's blessing. "Hold the line," he shouted to his comrades, parrying an undead claw that lashed out toward him. The battle was a blur of shrieks and steel, the consecrated ground beneath him glowing faintly as it repelled the undead. Corwin turned to block another strike, his blade biting into decayed flesh. For a moment, he felt invincible, the blessing coursing through him like fire. But in the din of battle, he didn't see the shadow behind him. The undead struck from behind, a jagged blade piercing his side. Corwin's breath hitched as pain flooded his body. He stumbled forward, his sword slipping from his grasp as he fell to his knees. "Corwin," a voice screamed, filled with anguish. Captain Ryan watched in horror as his soldier collapsed, the blessing's golden glow fading from his body. Rage and grief consumed him as he charged forward, his sword swinging in a deadly arc. The undead scattered under his fury, but Corwin lay still, his lifeblood pooling on the consecrated ground. The High Priestess felt the energy falter, her voice cracking as the divine connection wavered. "No," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the altar. "This cannot fail." Her eyes flicked toward the priests. "Buff me! Lend me all your strength!" The priests chanted louder, their staves glowing brighter as they poured their energy into her. The runes on the altar pulsed in response, but the divine light still refused to coalesce. In the distance, the undead regrouped, their relentless advance beginning anew. Captain Ryan fell to his knees beside Corwin's body, his bloodied hand gripping the young soldier's lifeless shoulder. His voice, raw and broken, echoed across the battlefield. "Corwin!" Chapter 6. The Dawn of Despair. The High Priestess knelt before the ancient altar, her hands trembling as she chanted with renewed vigor. Around her, priests poured their energy into her, their staves glowing brightly, but the divine light refused to coalesce. The air was thick with desperation, the runes flickering erratically as if mocking their efforts. Sweat streamed down her face as she raised her voice, her chant cracking under the weight of the ritual's failure. "More! Give me more!" she demanded, her gaze locking onto the priests who surrounded her. One by one they faltered, their staves dimming as exhaustion overtook them. The High Priestess slammed her hands onto the altar, her voice hoarse. "Why? Why is this not enough?" She rose abruptly, her movements frantic as she stumbled toward the chamber doors. Throwing them open, she stepped into the open air. The battlefield stretched out before her, illuminated by the faint glow of dawn. The sun had not yet risen, but the promise of light lingered on the horizon. Her voice trembled as she gazed at the pale sky. "Michael, why have you forsaken us?" Captain Ryan's sword cleaved through an undead soldier, its decayed body collapsing onto the blood-soaked ground. Around him, the Crusaders fought desperately, their faces etched with a mix of determination and fear. The golden glow of the High Priestess's blessing flickered faintly, a reminder of hope that was slipping through their fingers. "Hold the line," Ryan bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. His soldiers rallied, their shields forming a wall as they pushed back the relentless horde. The captain's eyes scanned the battlefield. He saw a young soldier stumble, his sword arm trembling as an undead lunged toward him. Without hesitation, Ryan charged, tackling the creature to the ground. The soldier's wide eyes met his, gratitude mingling with terror. Thank you, sir. Stay strong, Ryan said, gripping the young man's shoulder. For Highwall. Ryan's gaze swept across the battlefield again. He saw Commander Aldrich, his silver-plated armor gleaming as he fought alongside the troops. Aldrich's blade burned with holy energy, each strike carving through the undead with precision. For a moment, Ryan allowed himself to hope. Out of the chaos, a shadow moved with unnatural speed. Ryan felt a sharp, searing pain in his back as a jagged blade pierced his armor. His breath hitched, and his vision blurred as the strength drained from his body. He fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. Around him, the battlefield seemed to slow, the sounds of battle fading into a distant roar. "Captain!" a voice screamed. Aldrich turned, his eyes wide with horror as he saw Ryan collapse. He charged toward him, cutting through the undead that blocked his path. "No, Captain!" Aldrich cried, falling to his knees beside him. His hands trembled as he reached for him. "My battle res is on cooldown. Stay with the light, please." Ryan's lips moved, but no words came. His gaze drifted upward to the faint light of dawn breaking through the darkened sky. Aldrich rose slowly, his bloodied sword dangling from his hand. He looked across the battlefield, his heart sinking as he took in the devastation. Soldiers lay scattered among the fallen undead, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles. The consecrated ground that once held the horde at bay now glowed faintly, its light fading as the undead pushed forward. The cries of the wounded pierced the air, and the soldiers who still stood fought with wavering resolve, their movements sluggish and desperate. Aldrich's chest heaved, his breath shallow as despair threatened to overwhelm him. "Is this it?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Is this how it ends?" Then, through the haze of despair, a light caught his eye. It blazed brightly, cutting through the gloom like a beacon. It was her. The female paladin strode into the fray, her crimson-trimmed armor glowing with divine light. Her blade moved with impossible grace, slicing through the undead with ease. Each strike sent holy energy rippling through the horde, forcing them back with every swing. Aldrich's heart surged with renewed determination. He straightened, his grip tightening on his sword as he watched her fight. "She's not giving up," he muttered, his voice growing stronger, "and neither will we." Turning to his troops, Aldrich raised his sword high, its edge gleaming with holy energy. "Soldiers of Highwall, rally to me, the light will not falter." His voice boomed across the battlefield, cutting through the chaos. The Crusaders lifted their weapons, their cries echoing his. One by one they surged forward, their resolve reignited as they fought with renewed strength. Chapter 7: Wings of Light. The battlefield stretched endlessly under the darkened sky, a patchwork of consecrated ground glowing faintly and blood-soaked earth where the horde had pushed through. Screams of pain and defiance echoed in the air, underscored by the guttural growls of the undead. The Crusaders fought valiantly, but their movements grew slower, their strikes weaker. Amidst the chaos, the female paladin fought with a fiery resolve. Her crimson-trimmed armor bore the scars of countless blows, yet she moved with the precision of one who knew no fear. Her blade, slick with the ichor of the undead, sang as it cleaved through the unholy. But even she could feel it, the weight of despair creeping into her heart. For every enemy she struck down, two more seemed to take its place. Her breathing quickened, her grip on her sword tightening as the unrelenting tide pressed closer. And then she saw him. Commander Aldrich stood at the heart of the chaos, his silver-plated armor shining like a beacon amidst the dark. His sword, ablaze with holy energy, carved through the undead with an intensity that defied exhaustion. His voice, steady and commanding, rang out across the battlefield. "Soldiers of Highwall, rally to me, the light will not falter." His words cut through the noise, igniting a spark in every soldier who heard them. The Crusaders raised their weapons, their cries echoing his as they surged forward with renewed strength. The paladin's breath hitched. She had always admired Aldrich for his strength, his unyielding faith. Now, as she watched him lead with such fervor, she felt something stir within her. A flame, small at first, but growing with each passing moment. Her strikes became faster, harder. Her blade cut through the undead as though guided by the light itself. And then it happened. A warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading outward until it engulfed her entire being. She gasped, stumbling back as golden flames erupted around her. The heat didn't burn. Instead, it filled her with a power so overwhelming, it brought tears to her eyes. "By the light," she whispered. Wings of radiant energy unfurled from her back, each feather shimmering with divine light. The battlefield seemed to pause as every eye turned toward her. She took a step forward, her movements weightless, her blade blazing with holy fire. The undead recoiled, their shrieks of defiance turning to cries of fear. Each swing of her sword sent waves of divine energy rippling through their ranks, scattering them like leaves in a storm. "For Highwall," she roared, her voice ringing out like a celestial trumpet. Aldrich felt the shift immediately. The light from her transformation was unmistakable, blazing brighter than any torch on the battlefield. He turned for a fleeting moment, his breath catching in his chest as he saw her, the female paladin, wings of holy energy unfurled, her every movement a symphony of divine power. A flicker of pride and hope surged through him, a fragile but brilliant ember against the overwhelming darkness. Yet the battlefield offered no respite. He turned back, raising his shield just in time to block a blow aimed at one of his soldiers. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cacophony of war. The Crusaders around him rallied, their shields locking together as they pushed forward. Aldrich's blade flashed, cleaving through an undead soldier in a single, precise motion. His movements were deliberate, his strikes fueled by purpose rather than desperation. Yet even as he fought, he felt the weight of the unending tide pressing against their line. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure in tattered robes emerged from the ranks of the horde, its skeletal fingers clutching a staff that pulsed with a sickly green light. The air around it seemed to warp, the magic emanating from its presence distorting the very fabric of the battlefield. An undead mage. Aldrich's heart sank. He had faced such creatures before, and he knew the devastation they could wreak. He tightened his grip on his sword, the hilt slick with sweat and ichor. As the mage raised its staff, a bolt of fire erupted from its tip, hurtling toward him. Aldrich raised his shield, the impact sending a jarring tremor through his arm. The first bolt was followed by a second, then a third, each strike testing the limits of his strength. The golden glow of the High Priestess's blessing pulsed faintly on his shield, absorbing some of the impact, but he knew it would not last. The fourth bolt struck true, its force sending him to his knees. Aldrich gasped, the wind knocked from his lungs as pain lanced through his body. His sword fell from his grasp, clattering against the ground as the world around him blurred. The air seemed to thicken, each breath a battle in itself. "No," he growled, his voice a guttural rasp. He forced his head to lift, his vision swimming as he locked eyes with the mage. The creature stepped closer, its hollow gaze fixed on him with cruel satisfaction. Its staff crackled with energy, the air around it shimmering as it prepared another attack. Aldrich gritted his teeth, willing himself to stand, but his limbs refused to obey. Then, a shadow moved behind him. The blade came swiftly, jagged and cruel. It pierced his back with a sickening sound emerging through his chest in a spray of divine light. Aldrich's breath hitched, the pain searing and immediate. His gaze fell to the blade, his fingers twitching as he reached for it instinctively. But his strength was gone. He felt the cold embrace of the earth as he fell forward, his head striking the ground. His vision dimmed, the sounds of the battlefield fading into a distant hum. Aldrich's sword lay just beyond his grasp, its holy light flickering weakly as if mourning its master. "Captain!" a voice screamed, cutting through the cacophony of battle like a blade. The female paladin turned sharply, her radiant wings faltering as she followed the cry. Her heart sank as her eyes locked onto the motionless form of Commander Aldrich, his silver-plated armor stained with crimson streaks. The faint golden glow of the High Priestess's blessing flickered around him for a brief, mournful moment, before fading entirely, leaving him bathed in shadow. Her chest tightened, a visceral ache spreading through her body as the weight of his loss threatened to pull her to her knees. This wasn't just another casualty, it was Aldrich, their leader, their beacon of hope. Without him, the battle felt lost. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, her breath catching as the horde surged forward, emboldened by their triumph. Their guttural cries of victory echoed across the battlefield, their relentless advance, pressing harder against the Crusaders' the blunt, dwindling line. But then something shifted. The ache in her chest transformed, morphing into a burning fire that coursed through her veins. Her wings, dim and faltering, flared brighter than ever, their radiant light piercing the gloom. "No!" she roared, her voice echoing with divine fury. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with holy energy as she surged forward, her blade igniting with flames of celestial power. Each swing sent waves of light rippling through the horde, disintegrating the undead on contact. The force of her strikes carved a path straight through their ranks, scattering them like leaves in a storm. "For Aldrich," she cried, her voice carrying a raw, unyielding strength. "For Highwall." Her rallying cry rang out like a trumpet call, cutting through the despair that had gripped the Crusaders. Those nearest to her faltered for only a moment before their faces hardened with renewed resolve. The soldiers raised their weapons, their voices joining hers in a chorus of defiance. "For Aldrich! For Highwall!" The paladin's blade burned brighter with each strike, its holy light illuminating the battlefield like a second dawn. Her every movement was fueled by a ferocious combination of grief and fury, her swings growing faster and harder as she tore through the horde. The Crusaders surged forward behind her, their despair giving way to righteous anger. Their weapons glowed faintly with the remnants of the High Priestess's blessing, each strike landing with the strength of their renewed faith. The horde, emboldened just moments before, now faltered under the relentless assault. Their cohesion broke as the Crusaders drove them back, step by agonizing step. The female paladin's wings unfurled fully, their brilliance casting long shadows over the battlefield. Her strikes cleaved through multiple undead at once, the divine energy radiating from her blade forcing the horde to retreat in disarray. Yet even as she fought, her heart ached. She glanced back toward Aldrich's lifeless form, his bloodied sword lying just beyond his reach. The image seared into her mind, driving her forward with an almost manic determination. As the undead horde reeled, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. It was faint at first, a soft glow that barely touched the battlefield, but as the sun crept higher, its golden rays illuminated the chaos, turning the blood-streaked ground into a field of stark contrasts. The paladin stood at the forefront, her armor shimmering in the dawn's light. Her wings, now tinged with the sun's golden hue, seemed larger, more commanding. She raised her blade high, its flames still dancing as she turned to her comrades. "We will not falter," she cried, her voice hoarse but resolute. "For the light, for Highwall!" The Crusaders answered with a resounding cheer, their voices carrying across the battlefield. One by one, they pressed forward, their strikes filled with the strength of their convictions. For a moment, the paladin allowed herself to hope. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Unnatural, jarring. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. It was him. Aldrich's lifeless body, now animated by a foul and unnatural force, pushed itself to its feet. One skeletal hand reached down to retrieve his severed head, holding it aloft as his empty gaze locked onto her. In the other hand he gripped his sword, the divine glow now twisted into something dark and corrupted. He began to walk toward her, each step deliberate, each movement a cruel mockery of the man he once was. The paladin's wings faltered, their light dimming as her breath quickened. Her blade trembled in her hand. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising din of the horde. She staring into the hollow, lifeless eyes of the man who had once been her commander. The battlefield around her bathed in the soft light of a dawn that felt like anything but hope. Chapter 8. The Frost of Death. Liara stood motionless, her crimson-trimmed armor catching the faint glow of dawn. Before her loomed Aldrich, or what had once been him. His silver-plated armor was tarnished, streaked with crimson and darkened with unholy corruption. His hollow gaze locked onto hers, empty yet mocking. Green tendrils of aura swirled around him, the remnants of his once holy power now twisted into something vile and unnatural. This was no longer Commander Aldrich. This was a Death Knight. A Death Knight was a mockery of life, a being caught between the mortal plane and undeath. Their holy energy, meant to heal and protect, was corrupted into unholy power. Aldrich's once radiant aura had shifted to a sickly green, pulsating like a living disease. His sword, once a beacon of divine justice, now emanated a cold, malevolent glow, its edge dripping with frost. Even his presence felt oppressive, as though the very air around him was choking with despair. "Hello, Liara?" Aldrich said, his voice smooth yet chilling, like a whisper carried on a frozen wind. "There's no point in continuing this fight. Come with me to the other side. Embrace the inevitable." Liara's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the hilt of her blade. She wanted to speak, to scream, but the weight of his words, and the man he had once been, stilled her tongue. Then, like a distant echo, another voice broke through. "No, Liara." Aldrich's voice, trembling and filled with anguish, seemed to come from deep within him. "You must fight. Don't give in. Don't let him win." The duality of his words sent a shiver through her. Tears pricked her eyes as she struggled to reconcile the two voices, the man she had revered and the monster before her. She began, her voice faltering, but then she gritted her teeth, raising her blade. Her eyes burned with determination. "You are not the same. I will release Aldrich's soul from your grasp." Aldrich let out a low chuckle, his unholy aura flaring as he raised his corrupted blade. "Foolish paladin, let me show you the futility of your faith." Their swords clashed with a deafening roar, divine light meeting unholy frost. Sparks of golden and green energy lit up the battlefield as their strikes sent shockwaves rippling through the air. Liara fought with everything she had, her strikes precise and relentless. But Aldrich's movements were methodical, his strikes cold and calculated. Each swing of his blade left a trail of frost in its wake, the air growing colder with every clash. As the battle raged, Aldrich extended his free hand, dark energy swirling around his fingers. He muttered an incantation, and skeletal warriors clawed their way from the earth. "Go!" Aldrich commanded, his voice like the grinding of ice. The skeletons obeyed, their hollow eyes fixed on the High Priestess's chamber. Liara's heart raced. "No!" she cried, breaking away from Aldrich and sprinting after them. The skeletons moved swiftly, their clawed hands reaching for the chamber doors. Liara struck one down, but as she turned to face the others, she stumbled on the uneven ground. She rolled onto her back just as Aldrich loomed over her, his blade raised high. Time seemed to slow as the frost-covered edge descended toward her. She rolled out of the way, narrowly avoiding the strike, and scrambled to her feet, continuing her pursuit of the skeletons. The stairs to the chamber loomed ahead, but as she climbed, one of the skeletal warriors turned on her. She dispatched it with a swift strike, but her foot slipped on the icy steps. Before she could recover, Aldrich was upon her. His unholy blade struck her side, the cold searing through her armor and into her flesh. Liara gasped, her vision blurring as she collapsed onto the steps. Her blade clattered from her hand as she looked up at him, her breath shallow. Aldrich knelt beside Liara, his expression unreadable. "You were strong, Liara," he said softly, almost reverently. "But now your strength belongs to me." Her eyes widened as his blade touched her chest, the frost spreading like veins of ice. Her body stiffened, her wings faltering as their golden light dimmed. Aldrich's voice echoed, deep and commanding. "Rise, Liara." Her eyes turned white, frost spreading across her irises as her body convulsed. Slowly she stood, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her once radiant wings were now dark and frost-covered, their edges jagged and cold. She turned to Aldrich, her gaze empty yet filled with a cruel mockery of her former self. "Good," Aldrich said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Now, let us bring an end to this light." But then a piercing scream echoed from the direction of the High Priestess's chamber. Aldrich and Liara turned sharply, their gazes locking onto the towering structure. The lone skeleton that had escaped Liara's pursuit reached the altar within the chamber. The High Priestess stood defiant, her staff raised as divine light swirled around her. She struck down one skeleton, but the other lunged, its jagged blade piercing her side. She gasped, stumbling forward as her blood dripped onto the ancient altar. For a moment, silence enveloped the chamber. Then the runes on the altar ignited, their golden light surging upward in a blinding beam that pierced the darkened sky. The skeleton crumbled to ash, its unholy presence consumed by the divine energy. The High Priestess staggered, her strength fading. She leaned heavily on the altar, her bloodied hand clutching its edge. Despite the pain, a serene smile spread across her face as she whispered, "He comes." Her voice was barely audible, yet it resonated through the battlefield. The beam of light grew brighter, its golden glow spreading outward like the first rays of a long-forgotten dawn. Aldrich's expression darkened as he watched the beam of light, his grip tightening on his corrupted blade. "No," he hissed, his voice filled with both anger and unease. Liara, now a Death Knight, stood silently beside him, her frost-covered wings catching the eerie glow of the divine light. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, the undead halting their advance as the golden beam illuminated the scene. The High Priestess standing tall despite her mortal wound, her gaze fixed on the heavens as the light enveloped her. The faint outline of a figure, a celestial being with radiant wings, began to form within the beam, signaling the arrival of Michael. Chapter 9, By the Light. The golden beam of light piercing the heavens reached its crescendo, the brilliance too powerful for mortal eyes. The battlefield stilled as an overwhelming presence descended, each moment growing heavier as the divine energy filled the air. Then, like a comet blazing through the sky, Archangel Michael arrived. His descent was swift and unrelenting, his armored form radiant with divine power. He landed atop the High Priestess, her fragile mortal body splattering across the chapel in an explosion of crimson and light. The ground shook with the force of his landing, cracks spidering across the marble floor of the chapel. A blinding shockwave of holy light burst outward, sweeping through the entire city. The shockwave rolled through every crevasse, alley, and tower, its golden brilliance vaporizing the undead where they stood. Skeletal warriors disintegrated mid-lunge, their bones reduced to ash. The grotesque horde dissolved, their unholy energy consumed by the overwhelming purity of the light. Within moments, the city was silent, its streets no longer teeming with the dead. The holy light cleansed everything in its path, save for two figures who stood unscathed. Liara and Aldrich, the newly forged Death Knights, remained, their frost-tipped wings shimmering in the aftermath of the holy blast. Their unholy auras pulsed faintly, a testament to the power that shielded them from the light's wrath. Michael rose to his full height, his resplendent wings unfurling in a display of celestial might. His armor, crafted from heavenly gold, glowed with an otherworldly intensity. In one hand he held a radiant sword, its edge shimmering with divine fire. His piercing gaze fell upon Liara and Aldrich, his expression a mixture of sorrow and righteous fury. "Look upon what you have become," Michael said, his voice echoing like 1,000 trumpets. "Once you were the defenders of the light, champions of faith and virtue, and now you stand as twisted shadows of your former selves, consumed by darkness, bound by chains of unholy power." Liara shifted uncomfortably, her frost-covered wings flexing. Aldrich stood firm, his icy gaze locking onto the Archangel. Michael continued, his tone growing sharper. "This is the price of your hubris. You have forsaken the path of the light, and now you stand as abominations against the very essence you once swore to protect." Aldrich raised his frost-covered blade, his voice cold and defiant. "We are no longer bound by your light, Archangel. Your reign over this city is over." Liara followed, her frost-tipped wings flaring. "We are stronger than you could ever comprehend. Your words mean nothing." Michael's gaze hardened, his radiant sword igniting with celestial fire. "So be it. Let the light judge you." With a single beat of his wings, Michael surged forward, his blade crashing against Aldrich's with a deafening roar. Sparks of golden fire and icy frost erupted from their clash, the energy rippling outward in a blinding wave. Liara darted in, her frost-tipped wings slicing through the air as she swung her blade at Michael's exposed side. But the Archangel twisted with inhuman speed, his flaming sword meeting hers in a dazzling burst of light. The battlefield became a tempest of holy and unholy energy. Michael moved with divine precision, each swing of his blade a masterful strike that radiated golden fire. Aldrich's icy strikes countered with equal ferocity, his blade leaving trails of frost that froze the very air. Liara weaved between the two, her movements a blend of grace and unholy fury. Her frost-covered wings beat powerfully, sending shards of ice toward Michael, but the Archangel's radiant aura melted them before they could connect. "You are strong," Michael admitted, his voice steady as his blade clashed against Aldrich's. "But strength without purpose is hollow. You will fall." The battle raged with unrelenting ferocity. the clash of divine fire and unholy frost painting the battlefield in a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. Aldrich's strikes grew more desperate, his frost-covered blade carving through the air with raw power. Liara moved with deadly grace, her frost-tipped wings leaving icy trails as she pressed Michael from above. But Michael, unyielding as the heavens themselves, countered each attack with celestial precision. His radiant sword became an extension of his will, blazing with divine fire as it deflected Aldrich's icy swings and met Liara's frost-coated blade with devastating force. "Your darkness has no place here," Michael declared, his voice resonating across the city. "The light will cleanse this corruption." With a sudden surge of golden energy, Michael drove his flaming sword downward, meeting Aldrich's blade in a clash that sent shockwaves rippling through the air. The Death Knight's strength faltered as Michael's overwhelming power forced him to his knees. Aldrich's frost-covered wings drooped, their icy sheen dimming as his corrupted blade shattered under the might of Michael's strike. The once proud Death Knight let out a guttural growl, his unholy aura flickering and fading. Michael stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You were a warrior of light, Aldrich, and now you will be at peace." With a swift, merciful strike, Michael's blade pierced Aldrich's chest. A burst of golden light erupted, consuming the Death Knight in a radiant explosion. When the light faded, only silence remained where Aldrich had stood. Seeing her comrade fall, Liara let out a cry of rage, her frost-covered wings flaring as she launched herself at Michael. Her strikes were wild, fueled by unholy fury, but Michael's movements were deliberate and unyielding. "You are not beyond redemption," Michael said as he parried her attacks. "But if you will not yield, the light will show no mercy." Liara's blade clashed against Michael's, but the Archangel's divine strength overpowered her. With a final, devastating strike, Michael's sword shattered her weapon, sending shards of frost scattering across the battlefield. The Death Knight stumbled backward, her frost-tipped wings faltering as she collapsed to her knees. Michael stood over her, his radiant sword poised for the final blow. "Release her soul," he commanded, his voice softer now. Liara's frost-covered wings began to fade, the unholy corruption receding as a golden glow enveloped her. Her empty gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the Liara of old seemed to return. "Thank you," she whispered before the light consumed her, her form dissolving into golden embers that drifted upward toward the heavens. Michael lowered his sword, the battlefield now silent, save for the faint whispers of the wind. The city, cleansed by the light, stood in stark contrast to the devastation that had befallen it. As Michael surveyed the horizon, his piercing gaze caught movement. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, her silhouette framed by the faint light of dawn. It was Lilith. She walked with purpose, her crimson cloak billowing behind her. Her dark aura pulsed faintly, a stark contrast to the radiant light that still lingered in the city. Her gaze locked onto Michael, and a faint smile played on her lips. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the distance. "At last we meet." Michael's grip tightened on his blade as he turned fully to face her. "The light has no place for you, Lilith." Lilith chuckled, her voice dripping with malice. "Oh, but I'm not here for the light, I'm here for the end." Michael standing resolute, his sword glowing with divine fire as Lilith's presence loomed over the horizon,